Hi, I'm David Lane, Ludwig's Scientific Director. I'm excited to be here today to talk with postdocs at Ludwig's Oxford branch.
So in the genomics era, we're rapidly progressing towards personalized medicine. But for cancer, there are many patients that fall into a cycle of relapse, retreatment, and drug resistance until ultimately the cancer wins. What do you think we can do to overcome this obstacle? And do you think that strategies involving the immune system will be more viable, such as Dr. Weissman's anti-CD47 coupled with rituximab treatment?
Yeah, I think this is one of the key questions that we're struggling with at the moment. I mean, to come up with a new treatment and see the patient respond and then have the terrible frustration of seeing the disease come back is something that really affects us all, and makes us think that we have to think very hard about strategy. So one thing clearly is prevention. We know if we catch cancer early that we can have a huge impact on the number of people who will ultimately die from the disease. And we're putting a lot of effort into prevention now in the Ludwig, particularly tying up with the Hilton Foundation. So things we're doing there, for example, are the early detection of cancer, looking for blood markers, looking for other indications of the disease early. So more like what's happened with heart disease. If you catch the disease early, it's clear that you can have a very profound effect. And then I think we are also looking at immunological methods very strongly, like Irv is doing, because I think the immune system has this capability of kind of finding the last cancer cell. We know with drugs what tends to happen is a few cells are resistant and they come back, whereas it seems that the immune system is very good at kind of hunting out the few remaining cells. So the strategies that we have, like Irv's, around the immune system are seem to be very important to us. We've seen some successes. I mean, the Ludwig group in Johns Hopkins have developed the PAP test into a DNA test, and that's helping us to get early detection of ovarian cancer. And very recently, we've published in Science Translational Medicine a paper showing that you could detect tumor DNA in the blood, and this could allow you to not have to give chemotherapy to a patient after surgery. So these are all things that are very exciting. But I think if you look at the amazing results with some of the immune interventions, those are the ones that you have to sort of go for. To have a patient with metastatic melanoma be free of disease 5 years out is something amazing, and I think that's going to be a big push for us.
What do you believe will be the Ludwig's greatest contribution in the next 5 years to cancer research?
Gosh, 5 years. I'm always too optimistic, so whenever people ask me questions like that, I assume we'll do too much too quickly. But I think we should look and think very hard what that will be. There's no doubt that Ludwig's really on a roll at the moment. Things are going very well. So I think sequencing is going to make a huge difference. It's personalization of cancer care and being able to sequence so many patients' DNA in so many situations where, for example, they've had a drug or had immune therapy and you can measure what's happened is going to be very, very important. I think Bert Vogelstein and his crew are making enormous progress on circulating DNA, and I think that the ability to detect disease and monitor disease from the blood, for example, would be extremely important. And then we have one or two projects that just look to me like they're going incredibly well. We mentioned Irv Weissman's antibody, that's looking fantastic. We have another antibody to the EGFR receptor that's in the clinic now and is looking very promising. So there's lots of things that I think will happen, but I'm always surprised how long it actually takes. The translation's really hard, and getting the clinical trials done and seeing the results and being sure that you're safe and you're really helping patients is not easy. So we have to be moderate in our expectations, but I think those areas are the ones that one can predict. And then, of course, as we discussed, you never know what's going to happen, so there may be something that will change our minds. And I think the immune example is one that comes to mind. I don't think any of us expected that to happen quite so quickly. So we can see how the system does respond when there's a real breakthrough.
There appears to be a gap in the transition from novel basic science discoveries to the clinical setting. What steps do you feel need to be implemented to have an easier transition from bench-side discoveries to bedside therapies?
Yes, it's a good question. I think we need push on both sides. So I think basic scientists need to make sure that their research is very reproducible, very applicable, and try very hard to probe its importance, if you like. And then on the translational side, the pharmaceutical companies are very risk-averse, and so how do we close that gap? And it's all about, target validation and the degree of certainty that one can bring that your clinical approach is going to work, because clinical research can be very expensive. So Ludwig has its own in-house organization that is really involved in helping us to do those trials, and they certainly fill the gap. They help the scientists to get their work to the point where it really can be applied, and then they also are a bit more willing to take risk and take a long-term view. So one of the things, for example, that Ludwig's been very involved in is cancer vaccines and trying to develop such vaccines, and helped a lot with the HPV vaccine, but has also been trying to develop vaccines, for example, for lung cancer. It's been a long slog, and without the support and persistence of Ludwig, we wouldn't have got to the point where those vaccines are now in really advanced clinical trials. So I think you do need to have a continuum, but it requires essentially both sides to work together. And it's interesting in the interactions we've had with the pharmaceutical companies that they're getting more responsive to the Ludwig organization because they can see that we are willing to take our discoveries into the clinic. So I'm hopeful, but it's a constant struggle. And you realize the difference. I mean, science in the lab is jolly expensive, but when you start a clinical trial, you're moving into different numbers. So the risk factor is very strong, and that's why some things can languish. So I think my urge to scientists is to look at your research actually quite hard. I mean, you get your paper published, that's great, but what would be required really to convince somebody to spend a lot of money in a clinical trial, and what could you do to make that happen? And then use the network of Ludwig collaborators to sort of pose that question. And I think that's what some of these dialogues are about, is to just get people more aware of how they can work together.